Hello out there in the networking world. To all my friends and colleagues, I've decided to go ahead and make an attempt here to record a video, an instructional video, if you will, on installing and configuring GNS3 to support Cisco IOSv. This is very similar to what you might see if you were running, say, a Cisco Viral. There are certainly many different tutorials out there that discuss this topic, and oftentimes when I'm teaching my CCNP classes or my advanced routing and switching classes, or even my CCIE mentorship program, I use this program, GNS3, for pretty much all of our lab exercises and all of our practical exposure to the configuration elements of those courses. And certainly there's lots of tools that are available. I would definitely take a look at things like EVE-NG or Cisco Viral, VIRL. But GNS3 has always been kind of a staple, if you will, a package that we use. So I'll try to make this as brief as possible, but I want to kind of just run through the process. Now, with regard to the operating system that I'm running and the platform that I'm running, because this will, of course, vary depending on what type of platform you're running, I am running a Windows 10 platform here with kind of a basic setup, 32 gigs of memory, 64-bit operating system. And I'm running Intel Core i7 processor running at 3.3 gigahertz with Windows 10 Pro. So while most of these steps that I'm going to be going through should apply to what you're doing in your environment as well, just make note that obviously it's going to be different depending on your specific environment. So I'm going to walk through the steps of essentially configuring GNS3 to work with Cisco IOSv, so that you can install things like virtual appliances, ASAVs, 1000Vs, Nexus virtual routers, switches, and other virtual routers as well. I'm also going to make a note of how to install just a generic iOS platform as well, because some of the topologies that we deal with don't work necessarily with IOSv. For example, IOSv doesn't support serial interfaces. And so sometimes we may want to use a basic platform that's going to provide us the ability to connect serial interfaces to our environment. Now, I've gone through and I've uninstalled GNS3 on my platform here. So I just go to gns3.net or gns3.net or gns3.com, and I go to the download section. Presently, they're running 2.2.8. I haven't really found too many differences between that I use anyway, from version 2.2.0 up to 2.2.8. Certainly there are probably some significant differences, but what you'll do is you'll download, of course, this version of software. I've already actually downloaded it, and let me go into my folder here, and I'm going to go through the installation process of 2.2.8 to start with. If you take a look at it, if you're watching this video, I'm going to post in the comments section instructions on how to get access to all of these files that I'm going to be using in this video here. So I double click this installation package, and I'm going to go ahead and install it anyway. Now, most of the settings I've found here are going to be pretty standard, right? With regard to the options that I select and so on. So I'm just going to go ahead and agree to the installation. Going to use the standard menu folder, and I'm just going to install the GNS3 desktop application. We're actually going to install the VM separately because I want to show you a couple of settings that I like to prepare, a couple of things that I like to do prior to getting into setting up the GNS3 VM. We'll talk about that a little bit, and I'm going to go through the process of installing and setting up the VM as well, which is required, by the way, to run GNS3 for IOSv in this particular case. So I'm going to use the regular install directory, and we're going to go through the installation process. So I'm just going to pause the video here until we get to the point where we need to make some additional selections, and then we'll continue on. So the installation is completed. I'm going to go ahead and click Next here. Now, a SolarWinds standard tool set, I haven't really found personally any use for this. I'm not suggesting there isn't, but I don't typically use this tool set in what I'm doing with GNS3, even if I'm using Wireshark, for example, to do Wireshark captures. So I typically will say no here to install this tool set. I'm also going to uncheck this box to start GNS3 because there's a few other settings that I want to go through before I actually go through and set up GNS3, or actually get into the point where I'm starting GNS3 and so on. All right, so I've gone through the installation process. I didn't skip anything. Basically, I just installed GNS3 with its default settings. All right. Now, I have found from time to time, there is a packet capture application that's integrated with GNS3 called Wireshark, and it requires a back-end tool to allow that capture to take place. And I have found that with Windows 10, in some cases, you might have to download a secondary capture application and not install the default WinPCAP that comes with GNS3. I did find, though, with later versions of GNS3 that this has been resolved, so it shouldn't be an issue with 2.2.8. I believe I kind of got past this issue when I installed stuff versions above 2.2.0. So the next step in the process of configuring your desktop to work with IOSv is that you're going to need to install some sort of virtual machine software. Now, I choose to use VMware Workstation. I happen to run 15.x. I've put in the software folder VMware version, Workstation version 14.1.2. Which you can certainly use, but again, you need to install VMware Workstation. Now, one of the things that I do is there's a setting that needs to be set up, or a configuration that needs to be set up in VMware Workstation before you can actually go through and install the virtual machine. Or I would recommend anyway that you do before you go through and install the virtual machine. So once you have VMware Workstation installed and working, and again, you can use VirtualBox or maybe VMware Player. I'm using Workstation Pro, but if you want to use the Player version, you certainly can. And the steps might be slightly different in setting up the the hypervisor environment. But what you want to do is you want to go to Edit, and you want to go to your Virtual Network Editor. All right. Now, this will load essentially what you have with regard to different adapters and so on. I'm going to go ahead and delete the existing adapter that I have, and I'm going to go ahead and add it back after we go through the process. So I'm going to remove that network. Actually, I'm going to add it back so you can see what that process looks like. Okay. So typically, this is what your virtual machine environment would look like just kind of after you've installed everything. You don't have any networks added to the VMware Workstation environment. Now, what you want to do is you can click Add Network here if you'd like, but I found that in order to kind of administer the settings and to set up things for your particular environment, that you want to go ahead and operate this as in a privileged mode. So I always click that, and then it gives me additional options here. I'm going to add a network, and you can select essentially any one of these that you want. These are arbitrary values that you can choose. I'm going to go ahead and just choose VMNet1 in this particular case. I don't actually bridge GNS3 for my purpose. I don't bridge GNS3 to my physical interface or to my publicly routed space, if you will, or at least my TCP/IP routed space. So I actually just run this in host-only mode, which works very well for what I'm trying to do. You may decide to do it in bridged mode or NAT mode. Play around with the settings a little bit. Typically, you would only do that if you're trying to connect to, say, for example, other machines in your environment through a bridged connection in GNS3. It's kind of more of an advanced topic that we're not going to get into in this particular case. So I'm going to run this in host-only mode. And then you want to select a subnet for this adapter. This is very important because this is how you're going to set up the GNS3 VM to communicate with your GNS3 environment. So it'll pick a number for you, kind of an arbitrary number. It doesn't really matter what the class of the address space is or what the actual octets are. I always kind of just pick one that I don't suspect will cause any conflicts later on down the road. And that's it. I pretty much leave all of the other settings to the same value. You can certainly change the DHCP scope and modify those settings, but I pretty much leave those the same. And I'll just simply click apply, and that will create that virtual machine adapter for me, which I'm going to be using to tie into my GNS3 VM. All right, now once that's done provisioning, now I'll be in a position to install the GNS3 VM in my environment. Now you can get this GNS3 VM directly from the same place you downloaded GNS3. You'll notice right here, for optimal performance, please download the VM for GNS3. And they have it for VirtualBox, like I said, VMware Workstation and Fusion, VMware EXSI, and Microsoft Hyper-V. Now I've already downloaded it for VMware Workstation, so I'm just going to go here and go back to my GNS3 folder. It's very important that you use the VM version for the GNS3 version that you're installing. They're not backwards compatible and they're not cross compatible with different versions. So whenever you're downloading or upgrading GNS3, make sure you're always selecting the appropriate GNS3 VM based on what you've actually installed. Now I'm simply going to double click this virtual machine. Once I've already have VMware Workstation installed, it's going to basically say, okay, I'm going to use this template to deploy this virtual machine in your particular environment. I'm going to leave that as the name, but I'm going to choose to install this in an alternate directory just because I have a folder in my computer here, if I can find it. I have a folder in my computer where I keep all of my virtual machines. All right, and I'm just going to say GNS3. We'll use this same name here, VM 2.2.8. All right, so that's where we're going to install this in that folder. Make sure that it's, of course, mapped correctly, and I'm just going to simply click import. And what it's doing is it's basically building the virtual machine that's necessary for running all of your IOSv elements in GNS3. All right. Once this is imported, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that there are a couple of different settings that are set up in the GNS3 VM. And then I will be able to go into GNS3 and start to integrate this VM into GNS3. So I'm going to go to edit the virtual machine before I power it on. And there's a couple of things that I like to change here. I have lots of memory in my computer. I recommend running the VM with a minimum of 4 gigs. I run mine with 8 gigs just because I have some extra memory on my computer. But I've found that in most cases, 4 gigs of memory is sufficient to run multiple nodes within the GNS3 environment. Same thing with the processors. I have quite a few processors, so I'm going to go ahead and dedicate 2 processors and 2 cores. But this is a very important piece right here, this virtualization engine. You need to make sure that this virtualize Intel VT option is checked in order for GNS3 to work correctly with your computer. Now, this may require that you actually boot up in BIOS. Let me see if I can find an image of this And of course, it's going to be different for each platform. So what I've done is I've kind of just done a Google search enabling virtual machine in BIOS. Of course, you probably want to search on something more specific to your particular platform. But if you look at all of these different screenshots, these are all BIOS settings for different platforms. And in many cases, you're going to see something that says virtualization technology. That needs to be enabled in your system BIOS. And again, it'll show up in lots of different places. Here's an example, Intel virtualization technology. Here, Intel virtualization technology is disabled. That is going to prevent GNS3 from running correctly. So this is a setting that you would definitely have to change. Again, this is a PC environment, so it might be different for a Mac environment or a Linux. Of course, a Linux environment would probably be much simpler, but I'm running Windows in this particular case. So I want to make sure that I've allocated enough memory for GNS3 to run effectively. I typically run anywhere from 5 nodes up to 15 nodes in my environment, so I like to have lots and lots of memory. And then on the network adapter side, I want to go ahead and make sure that I select that specific adapter that I set up in my hypervisor application, whichever one you're using. In this particular case, I'm using a VMware Workstation 15. All right, so I'm going to hit OK. We're going to apply these settings. And at this point, the GNS3 VM is essentially installed and configured. So I'm going to go ahead and power on this virtual machine. There isn't a whole lot you have to do here, with regard to troubleshooting. As long as that virtualization technology is enabled and you have that virtualization checkbox in the GNS3 VM setup, you should be fine. Most importantly, there's 2 things that you should see here. Virtualization should be indicated. You shouldn't see a none there. And you should also see an IP address based on what you configured. Now, you could use this this VM to run Cisco IOU as well. That you would require then to install the license, the IOU license, and so on. I actually have a PDF in the folder that I'm going to post a link to in the comments section, where you can actually get those steps as well in a PDF. All right, so now the VM is running. I'm just going to go ahead and minimize that, and we're basically ready to go. So I'm going to start my GNS3 application, and I'm going to start to configure the settings. Now, prior to doing this, one of the other things that I typically would do is I would go into my firewall application, whichever one it is, and I would make sure that in the firewall that I'm allowing a couple of things to go through my firewall application. One of them is going to be Dynamips. Dynamips is a process that GNS3 uses for the emulation, and I'm just going to go ahead and make sure, change the settings here. I'm going to make sure that Dynamips is allowed through the firewall, and then in addition, I'm going to make sure that all of my GNS3 related applications are allowed through the firewall as well. And again, this is Windows Firewall. It really depends on your specific computer setup as to whether or not you'd have a third-party firewall application that you'd have to allow, or some other firewall software, right? Whether it's Mac OS-based firewall software or Linux or Windows. So when you open up GNS3, the first thing you're going to see is the ability to add additional appliances. I'm going to hit cancel here because I want to go through and set up some of the settings. We can see that in the server list here, my PC is listed as an available resource. This is used to run kind of native devices within GNS3, iOS devices, as well as the built-in devices in the device list, an Ethernet switch, an Ethernet hub, and so on. All right. So what I need to do now is I need to make sure that GNS3 is configured to work with my virtual machine as well. So I'm going to go to Edit, and I'm going to go to Preferences, and I'm going to click on the Server tab, and I'm going to make sure that in the host binding section here that I select the interface that is essentially the gateway address of that VMware host adapter that I created for my GNS3 VM. You might change the port number if you want. I really haven't seen too many areas where this port number would have to be changed. So I typically leave this at 3080, but it doesn't really matter what you put this at because it's local to your computer. It's just the port that you're going to use to establish a connection to the GNS3 VM, which, by the way, doesn't have to be configured on the GNS3 VM at all. So I'm going to go ahead and apply those settings. It's going to try to connect to the GNS3 VM, but I haven't set up those settings yet. All right, so we'll go ahead and apply those settings. And then there's one other step we have to perform before we can get this to work completely. Notice we got some errors here. It's connecting to the local host, but it's the GNS3 server connection is failing in this particular case. All right, that's because I need to go to GNS3 VM and I need to enable the GNS3 VM here, and I need to select the VM that I installed. I have lots of them on here, but it's kind of a pain sometimes this thing pops up, but if you can make sure that you get the appropriate GNS3 VM selected, again, make sure that you kind of allocate the appropriate amount of resources. Here, 8192 is what I selected, and 2 virtual CPUs. This does not have to match, and you can play around with these settings and find out what's kind of optimal for your environment. Leave them at default initially if you'd like. The other thing that I do is I check this radio button. This is important because when you close out, oftentimes you might have to reboot GNS3 because the application hangs or something like that, and you don't necessarily want to have the VM shut down and come back up each time. So by checking this radio button, I'm in essence just saying, hey, just leave that VM running even if I close out GNS3 because I might just be restarting GNS3. So now when I hit apply, what should happen in this case is after I get out of the GNS3 configuration, I should see both of my servers listed here. And it will depend on a couple of different things. It'll depend on how your firewall is set up. It'll depend on whether or not you have maybe some other conflicts on your computer as to whether or not these servers will show up. So oftentimes what I'll do is I'll just quit GNS3 and I'll make sure that my VM is still running. And then I'm just going to go back into GNS3, and hopefully after all the settings have been applied, give it a couple of minutes. Sometimes it takes a little bit for these to pop up, but I should see 2 different servers in my server summary list, and both of those servers should have a green node next to them, right? So you can see GNS3 VM 228 is not green. My local host server is green. So I'm just going to give it a minute. Notice now this has turned green. Now, if you've gotten to that point, you should be good to go. Everything should be working just fine. So now the only thing left is to actually kind of tune the settings and perhaps install some different appliances and so on. And that's what we're going to do in this particular case. All right, I am going to now add an IOSv router, and I'm going to add an IOSv switch, and I'm also going to add a traditional iOS-based switch as well, because I do like to use those if I'm doing iOS-based router, excuse me. I do like to use those if I'm doing you know, connection or builds that require a serial interface or something like that. Actually, there's one other setting I'm going to set first. The built-in console application is Solar Putty. I prefer to use Super Putty because it provides me tab-based access and some other features. So you can go out to Google and search on Super Putty. It's also in the folder the software folder that I provided a link to. But I'm going to set this up to work with Super Putty. So I already have the application installed. I'm just going to go ahead and put in manually the location, x86, and it is Super Putty, and the executable is superputty.exe. And again, these steps are in a PDF in the comment section below. There's a link to download the PDF that has screenshots of this as well. All right, so I'm going to use Telnet as my application, %H. I don't need to talk about these switches and what they represent. If you do set this up and you install Super Putty with its basic settings, there's one other thing you have to do in Super Putty. I'll make sure that we go through and show you that to make sure Super Putty will work. %P -WT and %D, and let's do a double quote at the end. All right. Again, this is specific to my computer, where the program is installed and so on. But I like to use this application. All right. I'll show you actually one of the other important settings that you're going to have with Super Putty. It's very important actually. When you go to the Putty of the options here, you need to make sure that the executable that you're using with Super Putty is the one that's installed in the GNS3 folder. Super Putty, when it gets installed by default, uses its own Putty executable. The switches and the arguments that we use, or the options that we use for the console application command, will not work with the Super Putty or the Super Putty referenced Putty executable. So make sure that you change this Putty exe location to the one that came with GNS3, or that gets installed with GNS3 by default. All right. So now we are on our really kind of our final step here, which is to go ahead and add a couple of our appliances. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and add an appliance. If you click this icon right here, basically browse all devices icon, and you click new template, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add an IOSv router. All right, so install an appliance from the GNS3 server. We're going to select a router. Now you can see we have lots of choices here, and certainly because we're now running this in a virtual machine environment, we can install things like let's see, a 1000V or a Cisco IOSv or an XRV 9000. I'm just going to use the generic IOSv platform and because that's the software that I have. Many of these different choices, these different hardware choices, people have posted the appropriate files online that you can download. So we're going to go ahead and hit install. We're going to install the appliance on the GNS3 VM. We're going to leave these settings as default. Now you'll notice that I have actually already one that's ready to be installed, this 15.61T. In the comments section, I posted a link to this folder. In the IOSv folder, I have the 3 files that I'm using to install the router and the switch. I found that these platforms work very well for just about any lab build that I do for my classes and for my own experimentation. Certainly you could use different versions. If you go back to GNS3, there may be a reason to run 15.7.3M3. I haven't found one, but personally, but certainly if you can get those files from somewhere online, you can certainly install that appliance. I use the 15.6.1T1. It works pretty well. So what you want to do is you want to highlight because yours will say missing, missing, missing when you do this install initially. You want to make sure that you highlight 15.6.1T in our particular case. Go to the VIOS Enterprise K9 option and click import. and then you're going to browse to wherever you stored those files. In our case, it's in the software folder, GNS3 software IOSv, and I'm simply going to select the appropriate file there. All right, so that's this file right here, which I already have installed. And then once it uploads that file, you're going to click the import option, right? Excuse me, we already did that. You're going to import the startup config as well. So we go back here, and there's the IOSv startup-config, or startup_config. You can modify this file if you want. Again, the defaults are pretty straightforward. Here's an important thing. Once both of these are green, found on GNS3 VM would not be what it should say. It should already say ready to install. But once it says ready to install, you highlight the appliance and then you click next. And it's going to say, would you like to install this appliance? I'm going to say yes, and I'm going to say finish. All right. And you'll notice now that we have the appliance listed in our all devices list, this 1561T. You can rename that, by the way. I like to leave it that because it tells me what iOS version I'm running there. All right. Now you can actually configure the template here. This is really useful because you'll notice here on the network side, you can add additional adapters if you want to have, I think it's up to, well, maybe more than 16. Everything I do is pretty much with four adapters. You can specify the format, you can specify the base MAC address of the device. You can play around with the different interface types. I've played around with it a little bit. I found that Intel Gigabit is the one that works in this particular case. And there's some other settings that you can set here. I don't really modify any of these settings for what I'm doing in my environment. All right. Default name format, you could modify what is the standard symbol and so on. How much memory. Most of the time I just leave these values at their default unless I come up with a specific use case scenario that requires me to modify those particular settings. All right, so now we're going to add our switch appliance. I'm going to click on the all devices category, click on new template. Again, install from a GNS3 server. And we're going to go to switches. And I'm going to go ahead and install an IOSv L2 device. And again, this is kind of generic, but you can see we have some Nexus options here. We have some Juniper switches as well. As long as you have the appropriate software, you can install those appliances as well. All right, so we're going to go ahead and click install, click next, next here. And again, I've already got this one installed, but again, you would go to import, find the local file. Once it said ready to install, then you click next and it will install that particular appliance. All right. It's waiting for the appliances, the files to be uploaded. All right. Now this name I don't really care for, so I typically will come here and just get rid of all of this stuff here because all I care about is the software version. In addition, on this one, I usually try to change the number of adapters to 4 or maybe 6 because if I'm doing something like spanning tree or if I'm doing you know, some other stuff with the switches, I don't like to see, you know, a whole bunch of different ports because I typically don't need that many ports in my configuration. So you can modify this as you add an appliance as well. It doesn't, this is just what the default would be in this particular case. A lot of times I'll change the base MAC address of the appliance to simulate specific topologies and environments and so on. So I've added my 2 IOSv devices. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a standard iOS device. I like to have a standard iOS device because again, there are some limitations to IOSv that a standard iOS device does not provide or does not have. So I'm going to do a manual template and I'm going to go to iOS routers. I'm going to create a new iOS router. Now you could run this in your VM or you could run it from your local host. I don't know that there's really much of a difference from a performance standpoint. I usually run my standard iOS devices from my local host to kind of share that resource. And then I'm going to browse to an image, whether it's a new image or an existing image. All right, I'm going to browse to an image that I have on my platform. Now here's an important thing. Depending on what platform you're using, I kind of use a standard image in my case. I love this 7200 image. It works very well. Certainly the 1000V image works, or the 1000 works well. There are some other platforms. I like this Advanced Enterprise K9 image, the 1524S7 image, because it does support quite a bit. You know, with regard to a lot of the features that most of my classes require. So I'm going to select this .image, and it's going to allow me to install that image. Now I already have it installed in my case, right? And you might actually be selecting a .bin or whatever, but I already have this image installed, so it is this one right here. So I'm going to go ahead and install that image. Now here's the thing. I've run into a situation where GNS3 will ask you if you want to extract the .bin to a .image. And I've run into situations where the terminal application doesn't work on certain computers if you extract the image as a .bin to a .image. So you can leave it as a .bin if you're running into a situation where for some reason the terminal application isn't responding. In other words, you put an appliance in your environment and then you right click it and go to click the console, and the console window comes up but nothing happens, right? Just kind of a little crazy workaround I found is that if you install the binary file and do not extract it as a .image, that fixes that particular problem. I haven't had that problem on my computer, so I will extract it as a .image. This is a 7200. I'm going to leave the standard megabits or the memory, and I like to use a 4-port Ethernet card and a 4-port serial interface card. This is the one that's critical here, right? Because a lot of topologies that you have to build require the use of a serial interface. So that is something that I like to install. Of course, you can add other adapters here. You can do an 8-port Ethernet adapter. You can do a gigabit Ethernet adapter, fast Ethernet, and so on. But I think the 4-port Ethernet adapters work just fine. And you're going to find that with most of the builds that Cisco uses for their classes, they use standard Ethernet ports as opposed to fast Ethernet or gigabit Ethernet. All right, so we're going to click Next. Now the idle PC is a very useful element as well. Notice it says here an idle PC value is necessary to prevent the iOS to use 100% of your processor. So I'm going to click this button. It might take a couple of minutes and it's going to go look for an idle PC value. Now if it doesn't find one here, don't panic. I'm not sure the internal process that's going on for it to be able to identify a particular value, but it does take a few minutes. We'll let it go through the process. If it finds a value, go ahead and use that value, whatever that value might be. If it doesn't find a value, that's okay. You can finish the installation even if it doesn't find a particular value there. All right. So it found a value for me that's suitable. I'm going to go ahead and use that value, and I'm just going to click Finish. All right. So now we have all three of the basic appliances that I use for most of my builds. And now I can start building a topology, right? So I can drop in my router here. I can come in here and change the symbol if I want. I kind of have a preference with these affinity square red symbols here, but it's up to you what symbols you like to use. They've got all kinds of different icons here that you can use. You could change that to be the default behavior as well. You can move around the name. And remember I said you can also configure the number of interfaces here. This is the base MAC address. This is really useful if you're doing things like a switch with spanning tree. That can be really, really useful when you're trying to establish what the base MAC address is of the device, because that will affect your spanning tree election process and so on. And I can bring in a switch as well. I can come in here and change the symbol for my switch. And you can change this one to the switch icon if you want. Again, this is mostly superficial, right? It doesn't really matter what the icon is, but it's kind of arbitrary. But I kind of have I like to use these symbols here. Notice the devices haven't started yet, right? And this is the console information. Now I can use my connector tool. I can also come in here and drop in a standard iOS device if I want. Again, changing the symbol to be whatever, I want it to be. In this case, a router. All right. And then I can start to connect these devices together. So I can take my gig interfaces on my IOSv platform and connect into my gig interface on my switch. I can take my Ethernet and fast Ethernet interfaces and connect them to my switch. You'll notice here that I also have some serial interfaces available as well to do serial connections. And then I can basically just start my appliances here. It takes a little bit of time for them to boot up, but once I've booted them up, I can start, build my topology, move them around and so on. And then I can console into these devices, which launches my Putty application. All right. Now, if you don't like the default font or the colors or whatnot here, you can go to Tools and you can go to Putty Configuration and you can change that appearance. I'm going to just change the font size. Once you made all the changes, the colors and everything that you want to change, if you wanted to save that for future connections, make sure you go to your connection tab. And in this case, we're using our session tab, excuse me. We're using our default settings. I'm going to go ahead and save that, highlight default settings and click save. So the next time I open up another window, let me go ahead and close this out. The next time I open up another window, in fact, let me rename this device as well. I'm going to just call this R2. And I'm going to call this ASW1. Change host name ASW1. Oops, wrong box. Let's do ASW1 there, or ASW2, and we'll just change the host name of this guy back to R2. All right. When I right-click and I go to the console, you'll notice that because of the switches I used in my Super Putty application, that it actually puts the name of the device here. I made a typo, so it's adding an extra backslash there, so I'm going to fix that. But and now I have access to my device. And you can open them all up at once if you want, or you can open them up individually. But the nice thing is it provides these tabs to allow you to open up each of those devices, and you can use your scripting tool to send commands to each of the devices and so on. That's why I like this particular application. I've got an extra backslash in my syntax there when I set that up, but and you can open up your multiple devices and you can tab through them and so on. One of the things that I do with Super Putty as well is, because it's annoying, you'll notice here that it doesn't let me drag the tabs down. I can move them across the top here if I want them in a particular order. That is a setting under Options to restrict floating windows. I always check that because it's really annoying. Sometimes I'll be working in Super Putty and I'll click a tab and then it'll think I'm trying to drag that tab out and move it somewhere else. So I like to set that up. Let me see where I have my extra backslash here under my console. Let's see. That looks correct. I'll have to figure out why it's adding that additional backslash in there, because those are the right switches. \% \d I know why. Because I forgot to add, there should be a quote right here in front of the %d. All right. Again, it's in the PDF that I provided. So now if I go in console here, I should just see, yeah, router 2. Perfect. All right. Now, there is one other thing I'm going to mention before I close up this, this video. When you go into the device, you're going to notice for your interfaces here, in IOSv on routers, the interfaces are always disabled by default. That's my, let me see, that's my iOS platform. My IOSv platform, show IP interface brief, the gig interfaces are going to be disabled by default. That's going to be the same with your iOS platform, but my point is, if you build a topology where you're configuring interfaces and you're setting up those interfaces, you're putting IP addresses and making them active and so on with the no shutdown command, even though you saved your configuration and everything in the configuration will save, IOSv routers, the interfaces are always shut down when you start them up the first time. It'll still maintain the rest of your configuration, but you have to go in and make sure that you turn on your interfaces as part of that process. With standard iOS, you don't have to do that. If you go into the configuration and you do a no shut as part of your standard configuration, those interfaces will be active when you load up your project file and you go into those devices. On switches, it doesn't matter. Switches, for example, in IOSv, all the interfaces are enabled by default. So we don't have to turn on those interfaces. As long as something is physically connected, the interfaces are going to come up automatically. All right? So obviously there's a lot more that we could discuss with regard to tuning GNS3 and setting it up. I guess there is one other thing that I would like to mention with regard to saving your projects. Oftentimes when I save a project, well, whenever you create a project, let me show you real quick. If I go to my program files directory on my C drive here, program files, GNS3. In this GNS3 folder, you're going to see all of your files. And one of the things in that folder is, if I can find it, actually it's probably going to be under users. Let's do that, C:users and Scott. And if I go to GNS3 here and I go to projects, you can see all the projects that I've been working on. And you'll notice when a project gets created, it actually creates a whole bunch of different project files. There's literally hundreds of files that get created with a particular project. These are certainly necessary if you're building the project and you're working with it, but I don't like to have all these files on my computer. So once I've gone through and I've completed a project, I will go ahead and delete that project from my computer. But before I do that, what I like to do is I like to go into GNS3 and I like to export the project as a portable project. So I just check the boxes, include the base image and the snapshots, and then I browse to wherever I want to save that file. Now the nice thing about this, let me go show you some that I've already saved for my CCNP Encore class. Let's see, Enterprise Core, Encore, Books and Labs, Discovery Labs. These are the files that I saved for each of the labs. Let me do a list view here. And you notice it's a single file, right? Now, the files are not very large. It makes them very portable. They're only about 35 megs each. It depends on the topology. But the wonderful thing about this is that when I want to use this project, I can go back into GNS3 and I can just simply say import a project. Go to that directory where I saved that project file, that single file, and I can just basically import that individual project file. All right, and then it's going to try and create a project for me, which is fine. You can let that happen. And that's going to go into that users directory. So now it's creating kind of all of those subdirectories and those files, which I will then go back and later delete because I don't want that stuff stored on my computer. I want to keep that single project file that I can import, and then I can build my topology and go through and do my configurations. Just makes it a little bit cleaner when you're dealing with all of the files and whatnot that are created in GNS3. So I've got my project here that I created. Notice it's nice and clean. It's got all the devices, and I can then start up my devices, and I can highlight all of them if I choose and click this little icon here, and it will open up all of those devices in my Super Putty, each tab for each of the devices. And then I can kind of go through here and start to do my different configurations. All right. Depending on how much resources you allocated towards the devices themselves will depend on how quickly they boot up and how quickly you can get access to them. I have found with IOSv that it does take a little bit more time. That's another thing too. If you're running .bin as opposed to .image, in other words, you're not extracting the .bin file, it seems to run a lot faster with IOSv as well. I have enough resources on my computer that I don't typically have to worry about it. All right, so I'm running, in this particular case, I am running for this build my 7200 image. So again, if I do a show IP interface brief, you can see the interfaces that I've configured are up. If this was IOSv, I would have to go and enable those router interfaces before my project could start working, which is a little bit of a pain, but you can do that with the script tool here. Pick the devices that you want to modify. You can highlight individual devices, and then you can go in here and type in the script that you want to push to those devices. Config T, interface gig 00, no shut, etc. Okay? So hopefully you found this lesson to be informative. Like I said, I'm going to post in the comments section how you can get access to everything you need to be able to do exactly what we did in this particular lesson. All right, so post a comment, reach out to us if you have any questions, and good luck in getting everything set up, and we'll see you in our next tutorial.